2 years ago in January 2022, truckers gathered in the township of Ottawa to protest the COVID vaccines. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's happened since then. Before we jump into this video, though, make sure that you hit that subscribe button as we're trying to grow the channel. Leave a comment down below and hit this like if you like the content. I am going to start with, this is not a politically driven video, so I'm not here to talk about the Liberal government, the Conservative government, the NDP government, the Independents, or anything of the sort. What I am here to talk about is specifically the government and how they overstepped in this situation, but this situation does happen more often than you think. So before we do that, let's jump into the day that Justin Trudeau decided to enact the Emergencies Act in Canada to shut down this protest, and we want to hear specifically from him what his thoughts were and what he was trying to do. So let's watch this together now.
After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address. The Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country. This is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting people's jobs, and restoring confidence in our institutions. These tools include strengthening their ability to impose fines or imprisonment. The government will designate, secure, and protect places and infrastructure that are critical to our economy and people's jobs, including border crossings and airports. We cannot and will not allow illegal and dangerous activities to continue. The Emergencies Act will also allow the government to make sure essential services are rendered, for example, in order to tow vehicles blocking roads. And finally, will enable the RCMP to enforce municipal bylaws and provincial offences where required. We're not using the Emergencies Act to call in the military. We're not suspending fundamental rights or overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are not limiting people's freedom of speech. We are not limiting freedom of peaceful assembly. We are not preventing people from exercising their right to protest legally. We'll always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades are illegal, and if you're still participating, the time to go home is now.
Okay, so based on that video alone, a lot of people and a lot of Canadians as well as non-Canadians were looking at this and were saying, wow, did the government overstep their bounds, right? Now, you do hear Mr. Trudeau say that he is not infringing on the Charter of Rights for Canadian people. For my American friends, that's the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence. Now, both of these essentially have the right to free speech and the right to form protest. It also states in there that we do have the right to not be searched or have our assets seized without probable cause. Now, I will play a clip here that explains that a little bit better for you, so that way we're all on the same page. Let me roll that now.
Ottawa's weeks-long gridlock warranted the government's attention, according to the federal court. But using the Emergencies Act to deal with it was not justified.
This is a huge victory for Canada and for everybody who cares about rights and freedoms. So it was a vindication as somebody who really believes in our constitutional rights and believes that for them to be meaningful, they need to be honestly grappled with.
Justice Richard Mosley ruled that the federal government violated 2 sections of the charter. Freezing bank accounts was an unreasonable search and seizure, and the nationwide order to stop protesting violated the right to free expression. One key factor, Ontario and Alberta had already shut down border protests, demonstrating it could be done.
So essentially what's happening here is the government of Canada said, hey, whoa, let's take a look at this holistically. Now, what happened with these protests? Okay, one, many people were upset because they wanted to have the choice whether or not they were going to get vaccinated. Now, some that decided not to get vaccinated might have lost a job, might have not have been able to, in this case, cross the border for one reason or another, and they wanted to make sure that they had the choice, and they also wanted to make sure that they had their voice heard. Furthermore, they felt that the government themselves had been overstepping in forcing some mandates that essentially made people get their vaccination. Whether or not you got your vaccination is not what's at issue here. It's the fact that the government is able to mandate this, and if you choose not to, in certain situations, you're out of a job or your livelihood may be threatened. Now, to go even further with this, a lot of these folks decided to get together and have what was called peaceful protests. Now, if you saw some of the clips, which I'll play some in the background, it did look pretty peaceful. Now, there was complaints that there was a lot of noise and there was some horns that were being honked and things like that. And the judge even came back and said that was an annoyance. And for the people that live down there, it probably wasn't very fun. But at the same time, this did not create any extreme violence, or it didn't really go out of the scope where the Emergencies Act would have to be put into play. Okay, so we'll keep going with that. From there was some situations that happened that I would say we all agreed that probably shouldn't happen. So in Coots, they found 4 players that were essentially from a cell, is what Justin Trudeau calls them, that were bad players, right? They had guns, they had intent to harm people, and they have gone on to be charged. Now, the RCMP in Alberta did take care of those folks, and they were able to manage that situation. But that was one of the situations that was used by the government to say, hey, this does afford us the luxury to be able to seize your assets. Let me rephrase that. In court, they said they did not seize the assets, but freeze your assets because they never took them, right? And they're able to look on your privacy, and they were able to take your freedom of speech away. Now, what this judge is saying is that there was a lot of concern with some of the protests that were going on. Now, specifically, he doesn't speak a lot about Ottawa other than how to contain the protests that were happening in Ottawa. The concerns were coming from the blockades that were essentially blocking trucks from going in and out of Canada and the United States at the 3 most traveled borders. That was a cost of $3 billion in goods that wasn't crossing the border at that time. Now, I would say my opinion is that this is just as bad as burning down a building or doing something that the taxpayers are going to have to pay for later on, and this should be dealt with. There's no question. But the judge does say that this was dealt at a local level, and they were successful using the laws at the local level to be able to essentially overcome some of the challenges that they had. Now, again, going back to the one in Coots, I don't think anybody would say, hey, we support the people in Coots that had the guns that were making threats and so on and so forth. And there's still information that needs to come out from that for us to really understand what was going on. But the federal government in all of these cases did not have to intervene to make these situations go away. And that's essentially what the federal government wanted. So my opinion, again, this is not a politically driven video, right? It's not about the Liberal government, but I will say it does seem to fall in line with Trudeau and the many times that he's overstepped his power and apologized for something that's happened. Now, in this case, he hasn't come out and apologized. His government actually comes and says that they are going to appeal and go all the way to the Supreme Court, which is pretty normal, right? And they're going to wait to see what the Supreme Court of Canada is going to do with this. Now, I would say that there is a chance that they come back and say that it was justified, but much like the lower courts, I think the Supreme Court is going to find that the rights of Canadian citizens had been infringed upon. Now, the reason why I wanted to do this video is that, is it okay for the government to overstep their bounds? No, absolutely not. For me, as a citizen, I go to work and then I have to go and pay taxes. In Canada, I pay even more taxes. I have a carbon tax after my income tax, and then I have a state tax, and then I have GST, and then sometimes I get some back, but I don't know when I get my carbon tax back or if I qualify for it, because we know over 50% of people in Canada don't know if they get it. I do get GST back sometime, and basically what it is wealth redistribution from the government. So what it looks like from somebody from the outside or somebody that's lived there, like I did for 20 plus years, is it is wealth redistribution, and that the government supersedes the individual when it comes to making decisions. Now that can get really dangerous because sometimes I don't always agree with what's going on with my government. And in this case, whether or not I agreed with what was going on with the truckers' convoy, or if COVID vaccinations needed to happen or not happen, I wasn't necessarily keen on the government overstepping and saying this is what needs to happen specifically for these protests, and here's why it becomes dangerous. If the government says that they have all these rights to freeze your assets just because you attended a protest, essentially what's going to happen is if a government, whether it's today or in the future, because governments do change, they can stop you from protesting any topic that they want and call it illegal, right? In this case, it was COVID, right? And I don't want to get caught up on that too much because some people wanted to get their vaccines, some people didn't. And that's okay. It is the freedom of choice of those people. I, for one, had to travel. I did get my vaccines. Again, I still support the folks that were protesting to not get their vaccines because it should be their choice. And I also support the folks that did get their vaccines because it's their choice as well. Now, there's a whole argument and debate that could go with that, but that's not this here. This is truly the government overstepping their bounds and saying, hey, when we make a law today, how is that going to impact us in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years down the road? Every time that the government gives themselves more power or decides to go away from the charter and that they infringe on, that means that they're opening the door to be able to do this over and over again and to do it in different circumstances. So maybe today you might agree, okay, I didn't agree with the topic that the people were protesting for, or it was really loud because I live downtown Ottawa. Then you have to agree if they do it again in 3 years for something totally different that you might agree with and you might be okay with that sound. And keep in mind, there's protests all the time about a lot of different things. And in North America, people are afraid of their government. In a lot of other places in the world, their government are afraid of their people. France is a great example. That's what we need. We elect people because we trust that those people are going to go into government and they are going to follow the rule of law. Now, what should happen? There should definitely be consequences for the people that don't follow the rule of law. In these cases, people are saying, okay, well, some truckers or people that have been arrested, like Tamara Litch, might end up getting some payouts. Okay, that's great. They're going to get a payout, but who's paying for that? Now, are these politicians paying for it, or is the taxpayer paying for it? So at the end of the day, it's still the taxpayer. So somebody made a mistake, and then the taxpayers like you and me, we have to pay for this. So this needs to stop happening. And in this case, we saw that the Canadian government stepped up and they said that this was wrong. The Canadian government overstepped, and we're waiting for the Supreme Court ruling to see if that's what it's going to be. From here, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think that the government overstepped? Do you think there's other instances that they have overstepped? And do you think that this opens the door for other governments to come in, interpret what happened here, and enact this in other situations that could end up infringing on your chartered rights? Also, if you've been with me this long, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button down below. We'll bring you some more videos. This is going to be part 1 of 2-part video. I will say, again, this is not a politically driven video. I could care less about liberals, conservatives, NDP, Tea parties, independents. But I will say I am not an advocate of Justin Trudeau, and my next video is going to highlight some of the mistakes that Justin Trudeau specifically has made, and we should have a little bit of fun with that video as well. But until next time, I'm your host, Tim Sahlberg. Again, leave that comment down below. I look forward to hearing from you folks soon. Talk to y'all later.